The economic case for investing in social and affordable housing. Hello everyone, Florian Heise here, and welcome to another episode of HeiseSays. Grab your stein of coffee because we're going to go through the final report that was prepared by Oxford Economics Australia for the CFMUE. You may have seen articles that are doing the rounds, and I haven't gone through them yet, but we certainly will, where the unions are calling for super profit taxes to invest in social and affordable housing. Now, my concern is that regardless of how good your motives are, any calls for implementing more tax always backfires. Then you create a scenario where organizations, rather than doing something productive, look at ways to avoid paying the tax, to minimize paying the tax. I mean, just think about it. There's entire industries just devoted to that. That's not really adding any value to our civilization at all, is it? And then what happens when they don't get the returns they were hoping? Well, it's the trickle-down effect, isn't it? The taxes trickle down to all of us. What's supposedly only going to impact a small amount of people, suddenly we're all paying income tax. Oh, isn't that funny? But rather than going through those articles first and discussing that issue and having fun with it, I thought we would actually go through the research prepared by Oxford Economics. Now, who are they? I'd call them a commercial economic research organization. They're not a think tank. World leader in, in economic forecasting, quantitative analysis, and thought leadership for businesses and governments. Now, this was commissioned by the CFMUE. I'm trying to find if they've got any bias in it. I mean, I'd argue they're economists, so it's going to be the bias inherent in some of the data collection methodology that they use. But nonetheless, this will be used to make informed decisions, and the union is using this to call for drastic tax changes to our country. So let's have a look at this economic case, everyone, here. So this is going to be probably we'll go through the whole report. It's only 30 pages, but it may end up being a bit longer. So it's probably the type of episode that you'll want to put on when you're, driving home or doing your commute. So I may release this later on today or tomorrow. Okay, let's look at the key findings. There are an estimated gap of 750,700 social and affordable dwellings in 2023. This includes a gap of 190,900 social dwellings and 559,800 affordable dwellings. The total gap has grown by 114,000 since 2014, so nearly 20%, 18%, and is expected to grow by another 196,200, 26% by 2041. Unmet demand for social and affordable housing is estimated to increase from 5.6% of total households in 2008 to 7.3% in 2023. Closing the housing gap could have significant benefits for the Australian economy. Increased social and affordable housing supply is estimated to lower rental prices and have a limited impact on property prices. The impact of lower rents and prices to inflation is marginal, with no meaningful change by 2024. There are additional benefits to closing the housing gap, including reductions in homelessness, improved productivity, economic growth, and better health outcomes. Now we have to, these things all sound good, but we have to remember what's going to happen, the super profit tax. Oh, we'll see. Maybe they've identified ways to minimize strategies to negate it. What about the decline in investment or the presentation of more sovereign risk here in Australia? Closing the housing gap requires an investment of $511 billion nominally. The total investment is based on 52,600 dwellings being built every year between 2023 and 2041. The cost of construction is expected to increase over the forecast period, adding to the required investment. The required investment can be reduced by bringing forward construction activity to limit the increasing cost of construction, noting capacity constraints in the sector. Yeah, you can't do that. I mean, that sounds great. Look at what's happened here with Home Builder, where we've overheated the construction sector. Projects are still getting significantly delayed, aren't they? I mean, it sounds nice. It sounds awesome. Just, you can not have to worry about that inflation-driven, all those construction costs by bringing all the work forward now when you'll overheat an already overheated market. I mean, okay, cool. It's great, easy to write, hard to do. Revenue from a super profit tax could fund the required investment to close the housing gap. An economy-wide what's a super profit? Could fund the $28 billion per annum required to close the housing gap in social and affordable housing by 2041. A super profit tax levied solely on mining projects. It's always on mining projects, isn't it? You've got all these environmentalists wanting to shut them down. They want Australia to stop exporting coal. We've got political parties with a significant number of people sitting in Parliament now wanting our country to stop exporting coal. You're not going to have that with this. Anyway, so a super profit tax just on the mining projects could fund the $93 billion that would be required to close the gap in social housing by 2033, as well as 12% of the affordable housing gap. A super profit tax is estimated to represent about 3% of the current government revenue receipts. What about reducing, looking at finding savings in the current government budgets, perhaps? Current government policies are not enough to close the housing gap. Well, I certainly agree with that. It's not going to, it's all bullshit, to be honest. Australia's state and territory governments have announced an estimated 30,000 new social dwellings earmarked for completion over the next 5 years. The current federal government's proposed Housing Australia Future Fund aims to provide 20,000 social homes and 10,000 affordable homes. The policy aims are still well shy of 750,700 dwellings needed to fill the current housing gap. Where are we going to build these dwellings? Is that at all addressed in this? Do they ever talk about where are we going to build these? Local authorities need to open up more land, need to make it easier to densify. Then you've got the whole not in my backyard crowd. You've got the Greens, and I'm picking on them because there's a local councillor that was ringing up and deceptively being Ipswich, pretending to be an Ipswich resident, to get a project there halted, which was going to be lower cost, more affordable housing. Well, no, not even, I wouldn't even call it affordable housing, just normal bloody housing. And he's sitting there in a suburb where his constituents have multi-million-dollar homes in Brisbane. Okay, so it's all, we got to build the things. You want 750,000 new homes? That's a lot of homes. That's a lot of land. That's a lot of timber. Where are you going to build it? Design features of a super profit tax impact the degree of economic distortions. The benefits of permanent, well-designed general excess profit taxes is that they are theoretically efficient, do not discourage investment, and automatically tax economic rent without the need to identify profitable sectors during specific episodes. Targeting excess profits precisely while ensuring sufficient incentives for firms to take on project risk is challenging, particularly where there is variation in business models and production structures, which is why this type of tax is not used more broadly. Yeah, we'll see how it goes. So let's have a look at the executive summary. The Oxford Economics Australia was engaged by the Construction, Forestry, Maritime, Mining and Energy Union to explore the economic case for investing in Australia's social and affordable housing, potentially funded by revenue from a super profit tax. Okay, so the super profit tax looks like it was a part of the genesis of this entire thing. So we need to keep that in mind. Okay, so all of these other arguments, are they pinned on the super profit tax? The first part of our analysis quantified the current gap in social and affordable dwellings by estimating unmet demand. We define unmet demand for social and affordable dwellings as rent-to households in the bottom two income quartiles who are paying more than 30% of their income on housing costs, plus those people experiencing homelessness. Okay, so the bottom two quartiles, if you're paying more than 30%, so you're the definition of housing stress. Well, let me just bring this up here, guys, because this is a little different to the definition we have of housing stress here. Okay, this is the one we got, and I'm just looking at it down here. What do we have? It's typically described as lower income households that spend more than 30% of their gross income on housing costs. So, do I have a definition of lower income? Here we go. Low income households, and this is from the ABS, refers to the 18% of households in the lowest equivalized disposable household income quintile, adjusted to exclude the first and second percentiles. So, yeah, I guess they're about on path with the ABS there, to be honest. Our analysis estimates there's currently a gap of 750,700 social and affordable dwellings in Australia, the housing gap. The gap is expected to rise to 946,900 if no action is taken to substantially increase the supply of social and affordable housing. Now, my concern with this 30%, I think it's an outdated metric. I think there are a lot of people that can quite comfortably survive on that, but it is, well, they are only focusing on the lowest quartile, so wealthier people can pay that with no problem. Our forecasts are broadly in line with the National Housing Finance and Investment Corporation estimates of 866,000 shortfall by 2041, slightly higher than the 729,000 shortfall in 2036, estimated by Troy et al. In 2019. Despite recent announcements for increased investment in the sector, such as the Housing Australia Future Fund, there is a significant shortfall in what is planned and what is needed. According to announcements by federal, state and territory governments, an estimated 30,000 new social dwellings are earmarked for completion between financial year 22 and financial year 27. Beyond 27, we have assumed long-term trends to the supply of these type of housing over the past decade continue. There are many social and economic benefits of closing the housing gap. Importantly, increasing supply of social and affordable dwellings will likely put downward pressure on rental growth, which is estimated to moderate to 2% per annum compared to the baseline forecast of 2.6% per annum. Meanwhile, forecast median price growth of 4% per annum would be tempered slightly to 3.8% with the housing gap fully closed. With minimal impact on house prices and inflation, this is unlikely to hurt investment in the broader property sector. In addition to property market impacts, research suggests that the provision of social and affordable housing can have additional benefits for Australian economy. Safe and affordable housing plays an important role in reducing homelessness, improving productivity and economic growth, and driving better health and income equality outcomes. So let's have a look here at the executive summary, guys. Our analysis also quantified the investment required to close the housing gap. This considered only the capital investment required to build the required social and affordable housing. The investment required to close the gap is significant and requires long-term revenue streams to ensure ongoing investment into the sector. We estimate an investment of $511 billion is needed to close the gap by 2041, or an average of $28 billion per year. So here's annual revenue versus investment required. There you go. Social investment, affordable investment. And here's the super profit tax revenue. It's why is it going to jump up there in 2028? Is that when they're increasing it? Closing the housing, and what if we don't make the super profit? What if there's a decline in demand for resources? Or what if suddenly, there's a more political push and impediments to mining? I mean, Labor isn't even supporting the coal industry. They want to detransition away from coal. Closing the housing gap earlier than 2041 may present some investment savings, but this needs to be considered in connection with the additional pressure it would place on the construction sector. I honestly think even this proposal would place significant pressure on the construction sector. Government investment in the social and affordable housing sector has the capacity to act as a support to the residential construction market by increasing investment into residential construction during periods of downturn with a relatively small role during periods of strong activity. The government can support supply without adding significantly to capacity constraints. Okay, cool. Let's see how that works. I mean, it sounds good, doesn't it? Just switch it on. But and that's what they would have to do. They would have to do it. They don't want to overheat the sector. But look at home builder. What if you don't get downturns, though? What if you don't get downturns? Finally, we consider if a super profit tax could raise the required revenue to fund the level of investment required to close the housing gap. Our analysis indicates that an economy-wide super profit tax could raise the $28 billion per annum investment required to close the housing gap in social and affordable housing by 2041 over the next decade alone. This could raise $290 billion. This includes $128 billion from mining projects, excluding those already covered by other resource rent taxes, and $163 billion from non-mining companies, with a turnover greater than $100 million. So what defines a super profit? Are we going to start seeing all of our groceries go up because the large Woolies and Coles have turnover of greater than $100 million? Remember, whenever you introduce a tax, who do you think pays it in the end? It's the consumer, one way or another, every time. Theoretically, a permanent, well-designed general excess profit tax is efficient and does not discourage investment. Any super profit tax should be designed to be fiscally stable to ensure confidence in the tax system and limit market distortions. I mean, it's easy to say all this stuff, but let's see how. Since discouraging investment would lead, in turn, to reduced economic activity, wages, growth, and therefore social welfare, it was designed to promote. At least they're aware of that. In particular, setting a single threshold across all non-mining companies may not take into account the variation in business models and production structures that can result in less efficient outcomes. These factors should be taken into account when considering the potential design of a super profit tax. Okay. So let's go to the introduction. How long we've been going here? 16 minutes. The purpose of this project is to explore the economic case for investing in Australia's social and affordable housing, potentially funded by a super profit tax. So the whole thing is based on a super profit tax, not just investing in social and affordable housing. I think there's some useful things we can take away from this report if you're not a fan of the idea of a super profit tax. What if rather than having a super profit tax hoovering away $28 billion per annum, we looked at other budget resources we could cut to perhaps provide a super profit tax? What about comparing, the rent assistance model to investing in social housing? What's more effective? That won't be looked at here. Anyway, the project aims to answer the following research questions. What is the current and forecast supply-demand gap in social, affordable, and total housing stock? How much of the gap is likely to be covered by the Australian Housing Future Fund? If less than 100%, how much further investment is required to close the housing gap? I don't like the fact that they're using gap. It reminds me too much of trying to close the gap with Indigenous Australians and how much that's failed. What are the economic impacts of closing the housing gap in social and affordable housing? In particular, what are the impacts on inflation, homelessness, and inequality? Could revenue from a super profit tax cover the required investment to close the housing gap? Based on academic literature, what is the economic rationale for taxes on economic corporate profits? What are the likely costs and benefits? Okay, well, so we can see here this is designed. Obviously, the union wants a super profit tax, and they want to redirect money from the mining sector into social, affordable housing and construction. The rest of the report follows the following structure. Australia's social and affordable housing gap provides context and forecasts of the stock and investment required to close the housing gap in social and affordable housing. The economic impacts of closing the housing gap explores the impact of closing the housing gap with a focus on property and rental prices, inflation, and homelessness. Funding the housing gap explores the possibility of introducing a super profit tax to fund the gap in social and affordable housing. They've got a technical appendix and references. Okay, good. Let's keep going here. I'm getting barely into this thing. I'm already getting tired. Okay. There's an estimated shortage of 750,700 social and affordable dwellings in 2023, 199,000 social and we'll call 560 affordable. The housing gap is expected to grow, yes, we know all this, to 946,000. For the purpose of this report, okay, hang on. I should stop skipping around. The housing gap is expected to grow to 946,900 dwellings by 2041, reflecting growth of 26% over the next 18 years. This growth is driven by a 31% increase in the social housing gap and a 25% increase in the affordable housing gap. For the purpose of this report, those in need of social and affordable housing or on-rent demand are renter households in the bottom two income quantiles who are paying more than 30% of their income in housing costs or on housing costs. These forecasts are based on an analysis of the variety of national level data and are used in this report to understand the scale of the existing shortfall in social and affordable dwellings, along with the anticipated future demand of such dwellings over the period to 2041. Supply gap forecasts also underpin estimates of the potential costs involved in developing adequate stock in order to close the gap. Now you have to understand these numbers are all pinned on their them using this 30% of income and the two income quantiles. Let me have a look at this. Let's look at just the definition here of a quantile. It refers to 1/5 of a particular group. Quantile 1 typically means the top 1/5 of the group. Quantile 2 refers to the bottom 1/5. Let's see if I'm pronouncing that right. Quintil, of course not. There you go, blame my German as my first language there. Nevertheless, we're looking at the bottom 2, and wait a minute. Okay, so 1/5, they're looking at the bottom 2. So they're saying 40% then. And if we look here at the definition of the ABS, it refers to 20%, essentially. So they're doubling their definition of what low-income households are compared to the ABS. Okay? So what's the difference? Do we agree with that? That's a question right there. Okay? That's a question right there. Maybe I should edit that back earlier in the video, but we'll see. So let's keep going. So so that's different to what the ABS's definition of low income is. They've got 2 quintals of it. 40% as opposed to 18%. It's not even 1 quintal. Bloody English. Our forecasts are broadly in line with the National Housing and Finance Investment Corporation 2021 estimates of 866,000 shortfall by 2040 and slightly higher than the 729,000 shortfall in 2036 estimates by Troy et al. Okay. Social housing plays a critical role, so the national overview, in supporting individuals and households who do not have the opportunity to access and sustain appropriate housing options in their community. Social housing made up 4.1% of total housing stock in 2023. This figure is estimated to decline to 3.7% by 2041, representing a decline of 0.4 percentage points over this period. These figures include the state and federal announced commitments to boost social housing supply from 22 to 27, with the general trends in supply driving long-run forecasts. The current social housing system incorporates public housing, community housing, state-owned and managed indigenous housing. Public housing is a form of subsidized housing that is owned and managed by state and territory governments. Community housing is instead owned and managed by non-profit organizations such as charities and has grown in prominence over recent years. So, state-owned and managed indigenous housing is a targeted subsidy towards indigenous households and provided by state and territory governments. Our analysis of social housing takes into account the supply and demand of these components combined. Between 2014 and 2023, there was an increase in Australia's dwelling stock of around 1.5 million, compared to an increase of just 22,600 in social dwelling stock, making up only 1.5% of the net change in total dwelling stock. The share of social housing dwelling stock to total dwelling stock has fallen from 4.5% in 2014 to 4.1% in 2023, relative to a national population which grew by an average of 1.3% per annum from 2014 to 2023. The social housing stock is shrinking, exacerbating issues of homelessness and rental stress. It's funny, our population is growing in so many ways. I looked at potable water. The potable water storage capacity that we have in Australia, it's decreasing as well relative to our population. The waitlist for social housing has risen from 162,600 households to, in 2014, 1.8% of total households, to an estimated 180,000 in 2023, 1.8%, with the figure anticipated to expand by an additional 67,800 applicants by 2041 to 247,900. This increasing demand for social housing is against a backdrop of slower growth in supply of social housing. So social housing government and social housing commitments. Let's have a look at this graph here. I mean, there you go. They're just forecasting it up. This is the wait list is just going to continue to get worse. State and territory governments are responsible, there you go, for supplying public houses, and various schemes are in place in order to provide the number of dwellings. So for those rusted-on Labor voters who keep blaming the federal government for the housing situation, how many states are run by Labor? You've got to realize these guys aren't going to help you. They're just going to feather their own nest one way or another. Maybe I'm just getting too old and cynical, guys. Including working with community housing providers to increase supply. In addition, the federal government provides funding to support states in providing social housing. According to announcements by state and territory governments, an estimated 30,000 new social dwellings are earmarked for completion between 22 and 27. Broader programs are summarized below, noting that some programs' delivery timeframes extend beyond the period of 27. So, Victoria's upcoming supply is driven by the Big Housing Build program, with a declaration of 9,300 new social housing dwellings. Queensland supply is to increase by 8,363 through the Housing Investment Fund and Quick Start Queensland Capital Investment Project. South Australia is committed to 3,600 new dwellings through their 23 state budget. Western Australia is increasing their Social Housing Investment Fund supply to 4,000 new dwellings over the next 5 years. The ACT has expanded funding towards their growing and renewing public housing program, adding an additional 400 public housing dwellings by 2025. The Tasmanian government has committed to building 10,000 new dwellings by 2032. New South Wales has declared an increased supply of 570. What? That's it? Through the next 5 years, through the Together Home Transition Program and the Social Investment Fund, the Northern Territory is set to receive 1,062 new dwellings through their community housing growth strategy and the transferring of properties to community housing providers. And the federal government has announced a new $2 billion social housing accelerator scheme, which will give states and territory governments funds to build or refurbish social housing. This information is used as a key input to the determination of subsequent analysis, and it is noted that forecasts of the social housing gap are predicted on the successful delivery of state and territory governments' official policy announcements, foreshadowing a substantial contribution to the supply of social dwellings in 22 to 27 period. If delivery was to fall short of the levels shown, then estimates of the social housing gap could be even larger and the cost to close the gap even higher. So if we have a look here, there you go. Now if we look at this, I'm just going to bring up this chart here. This is ABS dwelling approvals. And look at how many we have per month there. Okay? So that just puts it into comparison. We're looking at 10,000 here, and social housing per year that's guaranteed is, what are we looking at? We're not even reaching 10,000. So it's not even 1 month's worth of building approvals. Australia currently has a sizable shortage of social housing, with the shortfall estimated to be 190,900 dwellings in 2023. The national supply of social housing, 450,000 in 23, represents just 70% of the 640,000 dwellings demanded, falling significantly below the levels required to house those in need. Furthermore, this shortfall is expanded by 25% since 2017, or an additional 38,300 required social dwellings, as the volume of social housing applicants has been exceeding the number of available dwellings. A shortage of social housing leads to a need to prioritize the most vulnerable. Would someone in the 40% income quotile be considered the most vulnerable? I frankly wouldn't. Anyway, therefore, a substantial increase in supply will be necessary to meet the high demand for social housing in Australia and to ensure that it is not only those with the severest of needs who are able to access such dwellings. That's true. In addition to the existing shortfalls of around 190,900 dwellings, total demand for social housing is forecast to rise by almost 127,000 dwellings from 641 in 2023 to approximately 768,000 dwellings in 2041. These forecasts factor in total dwelling demand in the broader market as a result of the expected population growth, to which a trending share of social housing is applied over time. An additional 68,100 social dwellings are expected to be constructed over the period to 2041, noting that this estimate includes all of the anticipated 30,000 social housing additions expected to be delivered to 2027, with funding contributions from federal, state and territory government announcements. The total stock of social housing would expand from 450,200 dwellings in 23 to approximately 518,300 dwellings in 2041. The forecast of likely supply has been informed by the social housing schemes announced by the state and territory governments, augmented with the application of trending shares of the proportion of social housing stock compared with Australia's total dwelling stock over time. The result of this analysis shows that the social housing shortfall is expected to worsen, suggesting Australia will continue to follow recent patterns and fall short of building enough social housing to meet demand. Despite announced contributions from all levels of government, the shortfall of social housing in Australia is forecast to rise from 190,900 dwellings in 2023 to approximately 247,700 dwellings in 2041. So let's look at a national overview now of affordable housing. We acknowledge that affordability challenges extend to the owner-occupier market. The focus of this report prioritizes those in the rental market. The demographic and financial characterization of these renter households tend to be different to owner-occupier households. Income profiles of renter households are generally lower than owner-occupiers across age groups, and renters also tend to have lower savings buffers. Renters spend a larger proportion of their incomes on basic living expenses compared to owner-occupiers and have less spare cash flow, meaning renter households are more likely to experience financial stress than mortgages. And yet, everyone is forced to lock money away in the super funds rather than access that so they can get out of the rental market perhaps earlier. Why isn't there a discussion of that, of allowing the population? Maybe, here's an idea. What if you're in a lower income quintile? You have access to your superannuation as a house deposit. The affordable housing need is defined as those households with disposable household income within the bottom two quintiles, excluding rent assistance, calculated at the total Australian household level, where rent paid exceeds 30% of household income. This figure excludes those currently on a waiting list for social housing, with the assumption that the households are not demanding both social and affordable housing concurrently. Households in need of affordable housing are estimated to make up 5.1% of the total households in 2023. This is expected to ease in the short term before returning to relatively similar levels in the long run. Okay, now remember, their definition, they're taking two income. They're taking 40%. Not 18%, which is the ABS definition of low income. Why are they doing that? What would the figures be if they judged it on the 18% from the ABS? Why is this different? Can someone explain that to me? Is that bias? Or is there another reason behind that? Are they trying to paint an excessively negative picture to manipulate the masses and the politicians to make these drastic interventions? That's the question I'm putting out there. Or does the definition of low income, does it need to change? Does it need to change? Or maybe it has changed since I looked it up. Has it changed? The share of low income renter households in rental stress, paying more than 30% of their gross household income on rent, has increased by an estimated 1.7% to approximately 44% since the beginning of the pandemic. Pandemic's over now, isn't it? So I think it is. Although, yeah, I still see occasionally people wearing masks out and about, but no one seems to worry anymore. This is much higher than 35% experienced in 2008. Strong rental growth over the past 2 years has contributed to a deterioration in rental affordability and an increase in financial stress for some renter households. Furthermore, the short-term outlook in the Australian residential rental market is being impacted by a lack of new dwelling supply and an increase in rental demand as a result of strong returns of migration. Historically, the lion's share of international migrants will typically look to rent rather than buy upon arrival in markets that are already experiencing tight vacancy rates. Slowing rental growth, combined with the ongoing stream of the labour market over the next 2 years, is expected to unwind some of the affordability pressures that have built up over the pandemic, but long-term challenges remain. The proposed Housing Australia Future Fund identified the need to provide additional affordable dwellings for essential or key workers. While the term key worker has no official definition, these workers perform essential services for Australia's urban and regional populations. Professionals such as teachers, nurses, ambulance officers, fire emergency workers, and police are often cited as examples. Essentially, key workers are lower paid workers. Teachers aren't lower paid, they're on six figures, in occupations considered important to the proper functioning of a city, particularly those in low-paid service occupations, although not exclusively so, whose jobs are in areas of high housing costs. Key workers often do not earn enough money to afford to buy a home, and they may have affordability problems in the private rental market in a location relatively convenient to their workplace. Employers in such areas can also experience recruitment and retention problems as a result. This situation leads to growing spatial divide between the locations that low to moderate paid workers can afford to live and the location of job opportunities, especially those located in areas of high housing costs. The concern is that as gentrification has occurred in inner city locations, affordable housing has been pushed out of the inner areas. However, conversely, jobs have remained concentrated in these locations in and around Australia's city centres. One potential outcome of the increased concentration of jobs in the inner localities is that as a result, many low-paid workers find their housing opportunities have been pushed further from their workplaces. This in turn contributes to longer and more costly commutes for these people as they follow more affordable housing, as they follow the more affordable housing into the suburbs, increasing the social spatial divide. True, but what about, how many of these jobs can you do remote? Not many of those ones. Teachers, no. Nurses, no. Ambulance officers, no. Fire emergency workers, no. Police, no. So measuring the housing gap. So affordable housing differs from social housing in terms of funding arrangements. Affordable housing can be supplied by local government authorities, private investors, charitable organisations, or community housing providers. Affordable housing can be available for purchase, but is more prominent in the rental space, which will be the focus of this analysis. Currently, there's no data available on the number of affordable rental dwellings in Australia, and therefore an alternative to the typical supply-demand approach to assessing the size of any mismatch between the two spaces is required. Using the number of lower income households in rental stress, those spending 30% of their income, yes, which is different to the ABS. It's double what they're considering low income. I'm repeating again, is different to the ABS. Here, 18%. They're saying 40%. I guess they're calling it lower, not low. So, as our basis for assessing current and future unmet demand for affordable dwellings, an initial approach, which is consistent with the National Housing Finance and Investment Corporation report, it is estimated demand for 559,800 affordable dwellings is currently unmet in Australia. So why is the National Housing and Finance Investment Corporation using that definition? Or is it changed? The figure is in addition to the shortfall of social housing dwellings explored previously, where social housing demand is excluded from our affordable demand analysis. It is assumed that the share of local income households in rental distress will remain stable over the long run at approximately 42% of all lower income renting households. As tenants in rental distress often adjust behaviours to compensate, such as moving back in with parents or taking additional housemates. However, should a rise in this proportion eventuate, this will lead to additional demand for affordable housing. Over the period from 2023 to 2041, we estimate the number of lower income renter households that will be living in rental stress and will need affordable rental housing, i.e. the size of the gap in supply, will swell to approximately 697,200 affordable rental dwellings. This trend would represent a rise of 137,000 dwellings on the 2023 shortfall. While affordable housing can generally be defined as market and non-market affordable housing that is occupied by households in the lower 40%. Where is this defined as? Can be interpreted differently by different people. Furthermore, the specific forms and models that affordable housing can take are many and varied. However, affordable housing generally seeks to provide greater choice for low to moderate income households or accommodation for key workers. So, government affordable housing policies. The delivery of an additional 697,200 affordable dwellings in the period to 2041 is a substantial task. To work towards supplying this number of dwellings, local, state, territory and federal governments will have to align their policies and work together using a variety of funding and implementation strategies. Because of the scale of the challenges around housing affordability, agreement is needed on the role and responsibilities of all levels of government. In broad terms, the three main levels of Australian government have typically played the following roles relating to affordable housing. The federal government has largely acted as a funder of the states and territories via a range of schemes and programs. They've also taken responsibility for national housing and homelessness policy, financial sector regulation, and taxation settings. Direct intervention in the housing market have included such initiatives as Commonwealth Rent Assistance and the National Housing and Homelessness Agreement. State and territory governments have taken responsibility for land use and supply policy, urban planning and development policy, housing-related taxes and residential tenancy legislation regulation. And local governments mostly take ownership of building approval, urban planning and development approval processes, and rates and charges. They can influence affordable housing supply through their management or mismanagement of the planning scheme, including common approaches such as inclusionary zoning and voluntary planning agreements. Bridging the substantial affordable housing supply gap by 2041 will likely to require wider whole of government coordination to navigate pathways to deliver and address the shortfall of housing needs. I have been harping on about this for some time. I completely agree. Potential strategies may involve inclusionary zoning, voluntary planning agreements, allocation of council and government-owned land towards building affordable housing, government capital grants and operating subsidies, and potentially encouraging investment in affordable housing provided by the private sector. The affordable housing opportunities for the emerging build-to-rent residential sector, including the potential for expansion of build-to-buy schemes, such as the one developed by the NHFIC, is yet to be fully explored and may assist in improving tenancy security in conjunction with providing an opportunity to ramp up the supply of affordable housing. So what is the Australian Future Housing Fund? The Albanese Labor government has proposed off-budget legislation to enact the Housing Australia Future Fund, with the aim of enabling grants towards acute housing needs, social housing or affordable housing, and to fund grants made on the behalf of the National Housing Finance and Investment Corporation. Acute housing needs implies those requiring crisis housing, whereby being at risk or currently experiencing homelessness, ranging from short to long-term needs. The proposed fund was to begin with an allocated $10 billion, where funds would also be invested to provide up to $500 million annually to fund additional crises and social housing for those with the greatest need. Over the next 5 years, the fund aims to provide 20,000 social houses and 10,000 affordable houses to essential workers. However, the future of Labor's proposal is uncertain after voting in the Senate was pushed back to the 16th of October. If the legislation passes in its current form, the proposed investment into social housing and affordable dwelling is not enough to close the current gap of 750,700 dwellings. So investment required to close the gap. I need another shot of coffee here. Current social and affordable housing stock is insufficient to meet present and projected need. To estimate the funding required to close the supply gap by 2041 requires an assumption of when construction would occur and therefore the expected cost of construction. These estimates assume an even distribution of construction over the period spanning 2024 to 2041, comprising 13,872 social dwellings per annum, 38,733 affordable dwellings per annum, and 52,606 total social and affordable dwellings per annum. This level of new stock would occur in addition to the average 165,000 new dwellings expected to be developed each year over the forecast period. That's a lot of houses, guys. Every year, an additional 50,000 houses. Just think about that. An estimated 511 billion investment is required to close the housing gap in social and affordable housing by 2041, comprising 126 billion of funding for social housing and 384 billion of funding for affordable housing. This is approximately 28 billion per annum. However, this assumes that affordable housing is fully funded by government. In practice, we would expect the private market to supply a proportion of affordable housing. So here's the supply gap of social, affordable, and total, $510 billion. I mean, there you go, guys. So there's our dwelling construction gone down, and they're forecasting it to be hotter than it has been for some time. Okay. Investment required. We'll keep going. The timing of delivery of the 249,700 social dwellings and 697,200 of affordable dwellings will have a significant impact on the estimated total costs of closing the housing gap. Public and affordable construction costs grow over the forecast period in line with Oxford Economics residential construction deflator forecast. According to our modelling, the cost of construction is expected to grow by approximately 3.6% per annum over the next 18 years to 2041, rising a total of around 88% between 2023 and 2041. So just keep that in mind when people are predicting a housing price crash. Okay, just keep that in mind, guys. While an even distribution of development over the 18 period would necessitate funding of approximately 511 billion, several alternative scenarios are provided below to demonstrate the cost ranges which are influenced by timing. For example, if all 946,000 dwellings were built in 2024, noting that this timing is not feasible of course it's not feasible. You would completely overheat and saturate the market. I mean, come on, why even put it in here? Total funding of 383 billion will be required. Is that accounting for all the insanity you would cause to make that happen? That can't. Putting that even forward is stupid, honestly. Building from 30 to 41, total funding of 564 billion. Delaying until 2041 and then constructed in a consolidated year would require 687 billion. Okay, so this is the most likely one. We're already 50 billion over what they estimated. Oh, don't worry, just ramp up the super profit tax, guys. It'll be fine. Essentially, the longer it takes to close the housing gap, the more costly it is to the government. Delays in implementing such delivery will incur cost escalations, which in turn may mean dwellings are not delivered on the required scale and may not become available to the target demographic in the required time frame. The current environment for residential construction is challenging, and our current forecasts indicate a downturn in new supply. The high cost environment coupled with rising interest rates are creating barriers to build and ultimately putting financial pressure on builders who face risks of insolvency or project delays. This weaker outlook for dwelling supply coincides with a period of strong demand, which is likely to exacerbate affordability issues. Government investment into the social and affordable housing sector has the capacity to act as a support to the residential construction market by increasing investment into residential construction during periods of downturn, with a relatively smaller role during periods of strong activity. Yeah, I know, this is what they say. This is the plan. You think it's going to go to plan? You tell me if you think it's going to go to plan. Look at that. I'm running out of my coffee here on this one video. I still have to record my other ones for today. The government can support supply without adding significantly. Yeah, anyway. This counter-cyclical role can help stabilize the labor market and reduce volatility risks for the construction business. But what about your super profit tax? If you're seeing a downturn, wouldn't that flow through to that? Anyway, the economic impacts of closing the gap. Well, I'm going to go and probably have my breakfast and then come back and finish recording this one. Property market, including the implications for inflation and cost of living pressures. Additionally, broader channels that improved housing supply may flow through to the Australian economy and society are analysed through recent literature and research. The impact of increased social and affordable housing supply on dwellings, prices and rents expected to be relatively minor. Based on our property market modelling framework, the additional 946,900 combined social and affordable dwellings over the coming 18 years would result in median rental growth moderating to 2% per annum between 23 and 41, from our baseline estimate of 2.6%. The limited impact on rents, mostly in the lower segment of the market, and negligible impact on prices is unlikely to discourage private investment into housing in Australia. We expect the flow through to inflation will be marginal, with the decrease in rental prices due to increased supply of social and affordable housing, reducing overall inflation by 0.04% per year on average, leading to a 0.6% lower price level by 2041. Research highlights a number of key factors that are influenced by the provision of affordable housing. We have analysed this research to identify potential impacts of closing the housing gap and, where possible, focused on Australia and rental markets. Productivity losses have been linked to unaffordable and poor quality housing by taking away much needed resources from productive activities. Australian evidence suggests higher entry costs to the property market induce living further from centres of employment, impairing labour market opportunities in ways that reduce lifetime incomes, and adding to community cost effects. Poor quality and isolated housing could also impact economic productivity by generating an underutilisation of human capital, especially during younger years. There is an opportunity cost arising from channeling debt-fueled investment via higher rents and mortgage payments into housing stock, an asset essentially unproductive in terms of employment generation, which could potentially reduce economic growth. These problems are exacerbated for low-income households in highly populated areas. In Sydney, households of the lowest income quintile have only about 50% of the average household disposable income, but have to pay rent at about 80% of average rents. For the most disadvantaged households, this could be a potential generation problem, as public social housing has fallen from 5.8% of the housing stock in 97-98 to 3.1% in 2017-18. Additional social and affordable dwellings could help alleviate homelessness, particularly for those living in severely crowded and other crowded dwellings. Given the young age of most people living in these dwellings, the provision of social and affordable housing could result in positive, lifelong economic impacts, particularly in productivity and employment gains. Research suggests that individuals exposed to poor housing conditions report worse mental and physical health and experience an 11% increase in doctor's visits, increasing to 20% for age groups over 64. The housing shortage and homelessness is also exacerbated by low-income inequality, which crowds out low-income households from the rental market. In this sense, policy efforts addressing specifically homelessness are needed more sorely in places where local income inequalities has been increasing more quickly. The lack of affordable, adequate and secure housing generates avoidable public costs. Estimates of the lost well-being and generated costs have been calculated by providing a monetary value to the foregone social and affordable housing benefits. These calculations are based on a range of foregone benefits, including public sector cost savings, mainly related with avoided health and justice costs, private educational attainment, and increased disposable income. Importantly, these estimates do not include productivity gains or shared infrastructure gains. The current social and economic costs foregone wider benefits from affordable housing shortages have been estimated to be close to $677 million, 2022 nominal undiscounted, per annum, and are expected to increase to approximately $1,290 million per annum by 2036. So, over the long run, the impact of increased social and affordable housing supply on rents and dwelling prices in Australia is expected to be relatively minor. Based on our property market modelling framework, the addition of 249,700 social dwellings and a further 697,200 affordable dwellings over the coming 18 years will lead to a 10.4% reduction in median all-dwelling, i.e. combining rate of housing and unit rents, by 2041. This figure is compared to our baseline outlook, where despite almost 3 million net new dwellings developed over that time, at an annual average of 160,000 net new dwellings, the gap in social and affordable housing remains unfulfilled. This suggests that median rental growth would moderate to 2% between 23 and 41, from 2.6% per annum, our baseline outlook. Our model reflects that the relationship between supply and demand affects the amount of rental pressures in a residential market. Supply and demand work against each other until the point at which the equilibrium rent is achieved, i.e., the price where supply is equal to the demand in the market. People will bid up rents when there is relative scarcity, and should rent levels rise to a higher than equilibrium rent, this causes the quantity of rental dwellings supplied to increase, because suppliers have more incentive to build and own rental dwellings at a higher price. A major determinant of how much a household is willing to be able to pay to rent a dwelling is the household's income, and therefore is also one of the key modelling inputs. While the overall impact on median rents is expected to be relatively mild, the addition of significant levels of new supply would likely have uneven effects on different tiers of the housing market. New supply will likely improve affordability in all parts of the residential market. However, impacts at the most affordable end of the rental market would be expected to be higher than for premium end, owing to the removal of a notable share of concentrated demand. The owner-occupier market is less likely to be affected by a substantial rise in the provision of social and affordable dwelling. In Australia, therefore, the impacts on residential property prices are expected to be minimal. Residents in the two lowest income quintiles are far more likely to be living in private rental accommodation than seeking owner-occupier lending commitments. Our modelling indicates that a further 946,900 additional dwellings beyond our baseline scenario could induce a 2.5% reduction in the median all-dwelling price series by 2041. This suggests median price growth will be tempered slightly to 3.8% per annum from 4% per annum under our baseline scenario. These impacts would not be expected to discourage private investment into housing in Australia. The strength of demand related to demographic factors and the tightness of the rental market suggests that an expansion of new construction could reasonably be accommodated by the market. So the economic impacts and inflation. The impact of lower rental prices on inflation is marginal. The decrease in rental prices due to increased supply of social and affordable housing reduces overall inflation by an estimated 0.04% per year on average, leading to a 0.6% lower price level by 2041. In practice, we would not expect rental price changes of this magnitude to affect the inflation in the medium to long term, because we expect that the RBA is successful in their mandate to keep inflation within the 2 to 3% target band. What evidence is there to precedent would argue against that expectation, wouldn't it? Just saying. However, an impact of this magnitude is unlikely to affect RBA rate settings. One of the reasons these impacts are small is that rent accounts for only 5.75% of the overall CPI basket. However, rental prices will have a much greater impact on the cost of living of renter households at the lower end of the net wealth distribution than the average household reflected in the CPI basket. Nearly 90% of all households in the lowest wealth quintile were public or private renters in 2019 to 2022. It also takes time for rental increases to be reflected in the CPI series, since advertised rents are a small share of the total rental stock. Rents in the CPI increased 4% in 22, the strongest growth in the decade prior, but this is still 16% lower than the 20% growth advertised rents have experienced since 2019. Our estimates take the weighting for rents in the CPI basket and apply the modelling decrease in rental prices discussed above to our baseline CPI forecast. As a result, these estimates only include first-round price impacts. We'd expect that rent decreases also leads to higher discretionary income and would create inflationary pressures in other CPI components through higher spending. Given the significant share of lower-income renter households in rental stress, this impact is likely to improve households' ability to afford other living costs such as food, clothing, transport, and utilities. Lower-income households have a higher propensity to consume than average households. However, since a proportion of this income will be saved, the overall impact on inflation is likely to be negative. Lower average housing prices also has a negligible impact on CPI inflation. The CPI basket only contains new goods and does not include price changes to existing dwellings. The CPI basket does include new dwelling purchases by owner-occupiers, which reflects the cost of adding to the housing stock for owner-occupiers. However, our modelling of construction costs assumes that the government will not fund social and affordable housing at a level high enough to stretch market capacity of the construction industry and create an avoidable price shock for construction goods and services. Therefore, the 2.4% decline in average house prices has a negligible pass-through to CPI. Okay, now, that's an assumption. I would love to see how it can happen. So, homelessness. According to the latest census, there were 122,494 people experiencing homelessness on census night in 2021. These people are the ones defined under the ABS homelessness operational groups. An additional 93,186 were classified as marginally housed but not classified as homeless. The provision of social and affordable housing may reduce the number of people experiencing homelessness and housing insecurity. Homelessness is a complicated phenomenon that cannot be straightforwardly explained or solved by a single factor. While supplies of affordable housing are an important factor in reducing homelessness, the most recent literature seems to suggest their effects are underrepresented by the interrelationships between low unemployment and high incomes and rents. In short, per capita homelessness rates are unrelated to the proportion of at-risk groups that find themselves homeless. Effectively, when modelling per capita rates of homelessness, this omission masks the predicament of those truly vulnerable to homelessness. Supply of affordable housing and unemployment rates tend to be positively related. Where unemployment rates are high, the at-risk group of homelessness will be large. However, a high proportion of this group will be able to find housing because low-cost housing is more abundant in the regions where labour markets are weak. These regions are also ones that tend to feature high levels of social housing. Taken together, these effects might be masking the true impact of affordable housing on homelessness in Australia. The largest number of people experiencing homelessness are those living in severely crowded dwellings, while for those marginally housed, the vast majority reside in other crowded dwellings. Research from the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute identified that a lack of appropriate and affordable housing is a key driver for overcrowding, indicating that the provision of social and affordable housing of appropriate size and design could play an important role in reducing overcrowding and hence homelessness. The majority of people in crowded dwellings are aged below 35, meaning improved living conditions for this cohort could translate into lifelong productivity and employment gains for the individual and ultimately the economy. So funding the gap, or funding the housing gap. Funding the housing gap. This chapter considers whether the revenue from a super profit tax could fund the required investment to close the housing gap in social and affordable housing. It also discusses international precedent for super profit taxes and the potential cost and benefit of expanding the coverage of super profit taxes in Australia. Super profit taxes, also referred to as excess profit taxes or windfall taxes, are taxes levied on a company's economic rents. The profit above what is necessary to attract investment into the economic activity. Taxing economic rent has lower economic costs than other forms of taxation that represents the value of public property that is being transferred to private ownership. However, due to the difficulty of defining an appropriate threshold for excess profits and challenges of implementing these taxes have been introduced sparingly outside of the extractive sectors. Super profit taxes are commonly applied as permanent taxes in extraction sectors to return a fair value on public goods. Examples include Australia's petroleum resource rent tax and Norway's special petroleum tax. Super profit taxes are also applied in response to temporary unanticipated events, which lead some segments of the economy to disproportionately profit, usually at a time when other segments of the economy are suffering. For example, the European Commission recommended that member states impose a temporary tax on supernormal profits in energy companies as a result of the war in Ukraine to finance government actions taken to cushion the price shock to affected households and industries. For the purpose of this report, a super profit tax is assumed to be a permanent 40% tax on excess profits. What's the profit? What's the level of profit? 40%. Allowing for losses in previous years and a return on investment. The tax would apply to mining projects and non-mining companies with turnovers over 100 million. The thresholds, rates, and deductions of the tax follow the design features of the Parliamentary Budget Office costings that the estimates are based on. A tax of this kind would likely also be a very small subset, would likely apply to a very small subset of Australian companies. Reasons for this include the number of qualifying companies is small. Only about 3,000 or 0.3% of companies in Australia have a turnover of more than 100 million in 2021. Even very large companies do not pay tax every year. The ASX data shows that 20 to 30% of ASX 500 companies report a net loss to their shareholders in any given year. In 2021, 32% of companies had a turnover of 100 million did not pay tax in Australia. Yeah, well, what's happened in the last few years? I just wonder. Companies would be able to carry losses forward. Similar to the corporate income tax system, companies would be able to look back over 10 years prior to the introduction of the tax and accumulate a balance of super profit losses that could be utilized from the start of the proposal. In 2021, 11% of large businesses did not pay tax due to using losses in previous years. Yeah, that's business, isn't it? Despite this, taxes of this kind can still raise significant revenue. The PRRT is only paid by 8 to 14 companies each year, but following some design changes announced this year in this year's budget, the PRRT is expected to generate 13 billion over the next 5 years. And I wonder how many people hate those companies and don't realize how much they're supporting Australia. So, funding potential revenue from a super profit tax in Australia. The revenue from an economy-wide super profit tax could raise 290 billion over the next decade and fund the 28 billion per annum required to close the housing gap in social and affordable housing by 2041. On an annual basis, super profit taxes could raise, on average, 29 billion per annum, representing roughly 3% of the Treasury's expected tax receipts. A super profit tax leveled solely on mining projects, excluding those already covered by other resource rent taxes, could generate 128 billion over the next 10 years. By 2033, this would fully fund the 93 billion that would be required to close the gap in social housing, as well as 12% of the affordable housing gap. If a super profit tax was also levied on non-mining companies with a turnover greater than 100 million, an additional 163 billion could be raised over the next 10 years alone. Our central estimates are based on costings for similar policies prepared by the Parliamentary Budget Office and adjusted to reflect current economic conditions. PBO estimates for a super profit tax levied on mining projects are adjusted by the Department of Industry, Science and Resources forecasts of commodity export values. Revenue grows at a faster rate from financial year 28 to reflect that the starting capital base deductions cease after the first 5 years of the proposal. PBO estimates for a super profit tax levied on non-mining companies are adjusted by Treasury's 23-24 budget forecast for corporate gross operating surplus. However, there is a very high degree of uncertainty in these estimates. Revenue will differ significantly depending on economic cycles, as well as the design and implementation of the tax. For example, the threshold, tax rate, allowed deduction, and the degree to which companies intensify any tax avoidance activity will all significantly affect the revenue raised. Design features will also affect potential market distortions, which would have flow-on impacts to other revenue streams like corporate income tax. Further details of the modelling approach and assumptions are provided in the technical appendix. We can see here potential impacts of a super profit tax. Okay, this will be interesting to see. The following section highlights some of the potential economic impacts of introducing a super profit tax in Australia. To many, it can seem unfair or unreasonable when companies receive windfall profits without any extraordinary effort or action encouraging these increases. Well, they also have to bear the burden of their losses, don't they? But that's just business. Isn't that the whole point of being in a business? But, I mean, okay, we've got to understand who's funding this. On the other hand, non-neutral taxes can reduce investment and innovation, which are important factors underpinning economic growth and living standards over the long run. Therefore, Any proposed changes to Australia's tax regime must balance improved equity through the redistribution of wealth with the potential of reduced economic efficiency through market distortions. There are different views as to what constitutes an equitable return to the Australian community and what constitutes the discouragement of investment, along with the relative weight to be placed on either influence. The relative cost and benefits of any tax policy are highly dependent on the design features of the tax. In the case of super profit tax, correctly calibrating the threshold for excess profit is crucial. Setting a single threshold across all non-mining companies has the benefit of simplicity but risks market distortion if the variation in business models and production structures across different sectors is not accounted for. Investment. A common critique of any kind of tax levied on business is that it discourages investment, in turn reducing economic activity, wages, jobs, and therefore the social wealth it was designed to promote. Yes. In theory, super profit taxes are efficient and do not discourage investment. As the IMF notes, taxes on economic rents are efficient since they do not reduce investment because the tax applies only to returns above what is required to invest and can raise substantial revenues in sectors with persistent rents. Avoiding market distortions requires the threshold of the tax to be appropriately calibrated. Yeah. Are you confident that they can do that? Appropriately calibrated, which can be a challenge across different sectors with different production structures. True economic profits are difficult to determine in practice, which is why there is a risk of allocative harm, distortive effects when attempting to tax them. This is empirical evidence. There is empirical evidence that temporary windfall taxes have affected investment. However, if the threshold for excess profit is appropriately calibrated to reflect the return on investment, varies significantly between different industries, a permanent super tax should not discourage investment. Okay. Australia's experience with the petroleum resource rent tax shows that setting an appropriate threshold is possible. Industry participants who currently face the PRRT argued that because investors who encountered projects with poor rates of return did not face an additional tax royalty burden, there was a powerful incentive to invest in Australia. Treasury concluded that given the magnitude of the investment in Australia's petroleum industry over the past decade, it is evident that the PRRT is not discouraging investment. The IMF agrees that even with the PRRT in force, Australia's overall fiscal regime settings are not a detriment to investment. So, innovation and business formation. There is a concern that taxing excess profit removes incentives where profit expectations are highest, with detrimental effect on the economy, including innovation and lower business formation. Almost all economic activity is subject to fluctuations where profits in some years are offset by losses in others. ASX data shows that even extremely large companies will sometimes not make a profit in a year when they expand or face challenging market conditions. Some economists worry that taxing above average profits in good years will reduce market entries and thus the overall level of economic output and discourage firms from participating in innovation races, which produce many losers and few big winners. Design features can alleviate these concerns. It's all about managing the economy, isn't it? Managing an emergent system. Economic cycles can be accommodated by allowing losses in past years to be deducted from present year profits, as in the current corporate income system. If an appropriate threshold is set, entrepreneurial activity will not change. What maximizes net profit in a world without a profit tax will also maximize profit for the entrepreneur if the government diverts some of those profits to itself with a tax. So the potential impacts. Providing a fair return to the use for public resources. In the case of super profit taxes levied on mining companies, most minerals are owned by the state, and their extraction represents the value of public property that is being transferred to private ownership. The company has a reasonable expectation that when some of the property is given to a private party, the party will pay its full value. Stability. Stable fiscal settings are important for firms when making investment decisions. The E notes that when confidence into a reliable tax system is lost, uncertainty increases and affects future investments negatively. As part of Treasury's review into the PRT, stability in tax arrangements were emphasised by industry as being a major factor influencing the attractiveness of the country as an investment destination, and the stability of Australia's tax arrangements was said to be a factor influencing the 2012 to 2014 investment boom. It was noted that Norway was looked on favourably because there had been little change in its tax arrangements, notwithstanding its tax rate for petroleum is around 78%. In contrast, other jurisdictions were cited, such as the UK, who has increased taxes on the petroleum industry with a resulting decline in exploration and development. A common criticism of the spate of temporary windfall taxes currently under consideration in the EU is that by introducing ad hoc taxation, they erode trust in the rules-based system, increase investor risk, and reduce investment. Conversely, a permanent super profit tax with allowances for losses in previous years provides stability following the initial implementation. There may be a benefit to introducing super profit tax on mining projects if there is an expectation by investors that temporary windfall taxes may be introduced in the future. As the IMF notes, an intriguing argument in favour of rent taxing instruments in the energy sector is that they give investors more certainty ex ante, that more progressive fiscal regime reduces political pressure on the government to subsequently introduce ad hoc fiscal instruments if a windfall profit materializes. This argument is less persuasive for super profit taxes leveled on non-mining companies, since at present these are much less common. Tax avoidance leading to lower revenue and market distortions. A super profit tax, like the existing corporate income tax, is likely to face international pressure in the form of profit shifting and tax competition, potentially leading to lower revenues and market distortions. The IMF and EU recommends that a coordinated introduction of excess profit taxes is preferable to reduce the scope for tax arbitrage, and researchers have suggested that owing to emerging global tax data norms and governance structures, a global excise profit tax has better prospects than a series of unilateral measures. Tax avoidance could lead to market distortions if firms modify their financing structure, production structure, shareholding ratios, and the sectorial composition of the various subsidiaries in a way that their return on capital hardly shows an excess return. For example, the higher the company's capital stocks, the more profit the company is allowed to make without being penalized by regulators of tax authorities with the tax on the excessive profits or excess returns. This creates incentives for excessively capital-intensive production. It evokes evasive restrictions, which then lead to welfare losses because regulatory firms, in order to save taxes, deviate from cost-minimizing behavior. So household wealth. By reducing the after-tax profit of firms, a broad-based super profit tax could reduce the dividends paid to shareholders and therefore household wealth. Dividends represent a company's choice to return earnings to shareholders instead of being used for other alternatives. Australian companies have historically paid high dividends by international standards. This in part reflects the effect of tax policies and Australia's system of dividend imputation in particular. Compliance cost. There are administrative costs for businesses in complying with taxes, as well as costs borne by the ATO to administer the tax and to undertake audit activities to ensure compliance are minimal relative to the potential revenue raised. So, the international precedent for it. So let's look at these international precedents. You've got temporary, the United Kingdom's excess profit levy on top of the supplementary charge, the UK's EPL tax, company level profits from production activity at 25%. The tax expires at the earlier date of December 25 or once oil and natural gas prices return to normal levels. It estimates to raise an extra revenue of $5 billion in 12 months. The European Union Solidarity Tax proposes a 33% tax on profits that exceed 120% of average profits between 18 and 21. The EU estimates the tax would have generated €106 billion in 22. Finland's windfall profit tax policy in 2023 estimates a revenue of 0.5 to 1.3 billion euros. The permanent, here they're sector specific. General is the United Kingdom excess profit duty from 1905 to 26. In 1918, the tax was 80% of the amount of profits above pre-war standard of profits. Revenue was 32% of the total revenues in 1918, or 4.5% of GDP. United States applied a general excess profit tax from 1917 to 21 and 40 to 43. In 43, for example, it reached approximately 22% of total receipts, or 2.2% of GDP. Other temporary wartime time excess profits were in Canada, Denmark, France, Germany, Holland, Italy, New Zealand, Russia, and Spain. Permanent ones, we've got the Australian Petroleum Resource Rent Tax, introduced in 87. Sierra Leone, Timor-Leste, and others have similar designed taxes. Norway's special petroleum tax was introduced in 75. It comprises of Norway's 22% corporate rate as well as a 56% special tax on the oil and gas sector. Since oil production began in 69, about 80% of Norway's oil revenue has accrued to the people via Oil Fund 1.0, whose current 1.25 trillion balance is 3 times Norway's annual GDP. There you go. And let's see how demographic changes in Norway will affect that. Let's just watch and see the next 50 years. United Kingdom's supplementary charge was introduced in 2002. It's a tax of 10% on a company's profit from extraction activities. So permanent super profit taxes, which cover all sectors, are far less common, but have been proposed. So the IMF Globally Coordinated EPT proposes taxing the excessive profits of multinationals at a global level and allocating it to countries based on sales by destination. This is similar to the core idea of Pillar 1 of the 2021 Inclusive Framework Agreement to reform the taxation of multinationals. The Australian super profit tax, which we're talking about here, proposed a rate of 40% on company profits that exceed shareholder equity multiplied by 5% plus the long-term bond rate, with an offset for the first 100 million of turnover. The PBO estimates the underlying cash balance would increase by 87 billion in the total by 25 to 26 and 287 billion by 2032 to 33. So Australia's petroleum resource rent tax, the case study. Australia's petroleum resource rent tax has generated over 40 billion in revenue since payments were first made in 89 to 90, which includes revenue from the short-lived mineral resource rent tax. The PRRT functions as a charge for the transfer of community-owned national resources to private sector investors. The tax intends to promote the sustainable reinvestment of rent from the consumption of non-renewable resources into other forms of capital. Revenues from the PRRT have fluctuated since its inception in 1990. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, revenues averaged 0.2% of GDP per annum, reaching a peak of almost 2.5 billion in 2001 financial year. Since then, revenues as a proportion of GDP have been declining. Lower oil and gas prices and decreased production from mature fields reduced the average annual returns to an average of 0.12% of GDP per annum between financial year 2004 and 2016. Additionally, the level of deductible expenditure increased significantly during the mining boom from approximately 30 billion in 2013 to 250 billion in 2016. Beyond the overall reduction in revenue as a share of GDP, revenue has been relatively volatile. This is a result of the profit volatility of the mining sector and the competitive structure of the industry. So why, if this is the case study that they're putting forward, why are they anticipating this to be smooth sailing? Just asking. Just asking why. Profits in the mining sector are particularly sensitive to oil and coal price changes. Unexpected price shocks, disruptions to production, and large deductible capital expenditures can result in large differences between forecasts and actual revenue. Further, the structure of the sector and PRT is levied on the mining sector is made up of a small number of large taxpayers. This means that the deviation from forecast revenues for even one of these taxpayers can significantly impact overall revenue. The federal government has recently announced changes to the PRT in response to the Treasury Gas Transfer Pricing Review. These changes introduce a cap on the use of deductions for LNG projects to 90% of each taxpayer's PRT assessable receipts. This, along with the integrity reforms to be introduced from the 1st of July 2024, is expected to increase tax receipts by 2.4 billion over the forward estimates. The PPRT sets a precedent for super profit taxes in Australia, as discussed on page 27. industry participants agree that the PRRT has not discouraged investments. However, it also shows the importance of the design and structure of a super profit tax, despite the expectations that recent design reforms are expected to increase the revenue over the forward estimates. The PRRT hasn't generated the revenue that was expected when it was first introduced. Funny that, hey? So, Norway's special petroleum tax. This is the last one, the last case study. The Norway special petroleum tax was introduced in 1996 to ensure the country's most important industry makes an equally important contribution to the national budget each year. The super petroleum tax, when added to the corporate tax rate of 22%, taxes profits of the oil and gas sector at 78%. In 2023, the tax revenue from oil and gas is expected to reach $127 billion, representing $23,500 per citizen. This effectively designed taxation mechanism in Norway taxes profits relatively consistently, with revenues from taxation in line with industry revenues as profits grow. In contrast, the gap between industry and government revenues in Australia has been increasing since the early 1990s, particularly post-2016, as deductions have increased rapidly. Over this period, the Australian fossil fuel industry received billions of dollars of taxpayer-funded subsidies, with tax revenue remaining relatively unmoved as revenues surged. Now, that claim is from the Australian Institute. Now, how many of those subsidies are not forcing them to pay taxes for petrol when their vehicles aren't using the road system, which is the justification for the taxes? So continued development has taken place in Norway, the Norwegian petroleum tax system since inception. The petroleum tax system has moved away from an approach tailored to the prevailing oil price and towards a fixed regime independent of that price. Among the modifications which have yielded greater neutrality are the ability to carry losses forward with a risk-free interest rate, opportunities for transferring tax-related losses when winding up companies, and direct payment of the government's share of exploration costs by tax refund. These efforts towards neutrality encourage companies to maximize pre-tax value by avoiding distorting design features and maintaining incentives to continue production and invest in new exploration. Norway's super petroleum tax is widely considered to be near perfectly neutral. The funds raised by the Norwegian government from the petroleum industry are transferred in full to the government pension fund Global. The first transfer into the fund was made in 1996 and is now worth 1.9 trillion, or around 350,000 for each of Norway's 5.4 million citizens. These funds are used to ensure a more equitable and sustainable use of petroleum revenues, supporting pension expenditure and ensuring a second long-term contribution to intergenerational equality. Australia and Norwegian oil and gas industries have generated similar amounts of revenue over the past few years. However, the differences in structure from the Australian and Norwegian government in taxing the profits and extraction of natural resources has resulted in two vastly different outcomes. The key difference has been in the effective design of the PRRT to ensure the level of economic rent collected from oil and gas extraction is relative to the importance of the industry to their economy. Equally important has been the development of a relatively neutral and well-structured tax system in order to maintain incentives and ensure industry and government revenues do not become disconnected. And here we have the technical aspect, and I'll let you go through this on your own. Quantifying the gap, the demand for social housing, rents, prices, and inflation, non-mining SPT revenue estimates. Central estimates for a super profit tax leveled on non-mining companies are based on costs for similar policies prepared by the Parliamentary Budget Office. The PBO costings are based on a policy which would introduce a 40% tax on post-company tax Australia-sourced profits for companies with a turnover greater of $100 billion, with an allowance for corporate equity equal to shareholder equity multiplied by 5% plus the long-term bond rate. Companies would be able to look back over the 10 years prior to the introduction of the tax and accumulate a balance sheet of super profits losses that can be utilized from the start of the proposal. Super profit tax would not be deductible for company tax purposes. We adjust the SPT revenue estimates in the PBO costings from 21 to 22 to reflect current economic conditions. In the short run, the PBO estimates of SPT revenue are adjusted by Treasury's budget forecast of corporate gross operating surplus. In the long run, it is assumed that corporate gross operating surplus stabilize as a share of nominal GDP, and therefore is grown by Treasurer's long-run forecast of nominal GDP. The final central estimate is that the simple average of the two PBO costings, including a second round impacts on personal income through lower dividend payments and the cost of the ATO to administer the tax. We can see here what they're projecting. And here's the mining revenue. I mean, look at the band, everyone. Look at the band, guys. And then we have the references, guys. So let's, that was a long one. Let's have a chat about this. I need a shot of coffee. What do you think? What do you think? One thing that concerns me is that, well, their definition. Well, they're not using low income, they're using lower income. They're counting 40%, not 18% like the ABS. It's a little different. So perhaps that's inflating the demand for social and affordable housing that they're arguing for. But look at the precedent they put forward. Everyone loves Norway, fantastic. Is that actually comparable what's happened there with their taxation of their natural resources to over here in Australia? Okay, forget that. Let's look at the precedent here in Australia. It didn't work. It didn't raise the money they anticipated. Do you think it'll work here in Australia, guys? What do you reckon? And this is only one step to having, maybe we need to reduce it to 50 million or then 20 million. 100 million ain't that much. 20 million ain't that much for companies. Who do you think is going to be paying for this in the end? You tell me, guys. Anyway, thank you all for watching. Check out Heise, a bit more Heise does for other videos I discuss, not all this long. I'm tired. Support the channel on YouTube or Patreon. Use our referral links, buy a pocket squares, or call me if you need an architect. Take care, have a great day, and I'll see you all in the next episode of HeiseSays. Bye for now.